Daughter told me I was moving into a retirement residence in Barrie and that she'd already listed the cottage for sale. I didn't argue. I signed everything she put in front of me. For 9 days, she and her husband toasted their good fortune over wine I'd never been offered. Then the buyers arrived with their deposit check, and the lawyer slid a single envelope across the table, and I watched my daughter's face come apart. "Good morning, friends. It's Donna again, and I'm so glad you found your way back to me. Before I begin, do me a small kindness. Press that like button, stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments which town or city you're listening from. I like to imagine my voice traveling out across this big country of ours, from a kitchen in Halifax to a truck stop somewhere past Thunder Bay. It makes an old woman feel less alone. My name is Eleanor Ruth Holloway, and I have lived in the same cottage on Cameron Lake for 43 years. I want you to sit with that number a moment before I tell you the rest, because numbers like that aren't just numbers, they're winters. They're the year my husband Frank and I drove up from the city with a U-Haul and more confidence than money, that the dock he rebuilt 3 times because the ice kept taking it. They're the maple out front that I planted as a switch and that now shades the whole front porch in July. Frank passed in the autumn before last, on a gray Tuesday in October. In the recliner he refused to replace, though the spring had gone out of it years before. One minute he was doing the crossword and asking me a 6-letter word for regret, and the next he was simply gone, the pencil still in his hand. I became a widow at 71 with a paid-off cottage, a small pension, and a daughter who lived 2 hours south in Mississauga. Her name is Patricia, though Frank and I always called her Trish. I tell you her name because I've decided I'm done protecting people who wouldn't protect me. For the first few months after the funeral, Trish was lovely. She phoned on Sundays. She drove up with her husband Greg and brought those grocery store flowers wrapped in cellophane, and she sat with me at the kitchen table and let me talk about her father. I remember thinking, in my grief, that at least I'd raised her right, that whatever else had gone wrong over the years, the bone of her was good. Grief, I've since learned, makes you generous with your assumptions. The change came slowly, the way the ice comes in on the lake. You don't see it form. You just wake up one morning, and the water's gone hard. It started with the questions. Greg, who in 22 years of marriage to my daughter had never once asked me a single thing about myself, suddenly wanted to know about the property. What did I figure waterfront was going for these days up on Cameron? Had I ever had it appraised? He asked it the way a man asks who's already looked it up and just wants to watch your face while you answer. I told him I had no idea and no reason to find out. The cottage wasn't for sale. He smiled and said, "Sure, sure," in that voice people use when they've decided you're a problem to be solved. Then Trish started in about how big the place was for one person, how the stairs to the loft must be hard on my knees, how the winters up here were so isolating, weren't they, with the nearest neighbor half a kilometer off and the snow blowing in from the lake. She'd say these things while looking around the room, slowly, the way you'd appraise a stranger's house at an estate sale. I'd catch her doing the math behind her eyes. I want to be fair because fairness matters to me even now. There was a version of those conversations that would have been love. A daughter who genuinely worried about her mother alone on a frozen lake. That daughter exists. And if Trish had been her, I'd have listened. But I have known my child for 46 years. I know the difference between worry that's about me and worry that's about something I have. And what I saw in her face that spring wasn't fear for my safety. It was impatience, the particular impatience of someone waiting on an inheritance that's taking too long to inherit. In March, she sat me down at the same kitchen table where she'd done her homework for 12 years, where Frank had taught her to play crib, where I'd iced 1,000 birthday cakes, and she told me, she did not ask me. She told me that she and Greg had found a lovely spot for me at a retirement residence near them in Barrie. Riverside Gardens it was called, though there was no river that I ever saw. She said it would be so much easier. She said I'd have my meals made and people my own age and a nurse just down the hall. And then Greg leaned in and added, "And honestly, Eleanor, a property like this, sitting empty half the time, It just makes more sense to free up the capital. Free up the capital. He said it about my home, with my late husband's ashes still in the ground under the maple, and he said it the way you'd talk about a stock that wasn't performing. I looked at the two of them. I looked at Trish, who wouldn't quite meet my eye. I looked at the snow melting off the eaves outside the window, dripping its little rhythm onto the sill the way it had every March for 43 years. And something inside me, something very old and very quiet, sat up and started paying attention. I didn't say no. That's the part people find hard to understand, so let me explain it the way I understood it that day. If I'd said no, a flat, clear no, I knew exactly what would happen, because I'd seen Greg work before. He'd have started a campaign. He'd have brought up my confusion. He'd have mentioned gently to anyone who'd listen that Mom was getting forgetful, that Mom couldn't manage, that Mom had left the stove on that one time, which I never did, but it doesn't matter, because the suggestion is the weapon, not the truth. I've watched it happen to women I know. You fight openly, and they reframe the fight itself as proof you've lost your marbles. So I did the only thing that gave me room to breathe. I let them think they'd won. I said it was a lot to take in. I said I suppose they had a point about the stairs. I said maybe they could send me the brochure for Riverside Gardens and I'd have a look. Trisha's whole body softened with relief, and I hated how good that relief felt to her. How easy. Greg actually patted my hand. "We just want what's best for you," he said, and I nodded, and inside I thought, "Child, you have no idea what you've started." The next morning I drove into Lindsay to the public library, which has always been one of my favorite places on this earth. Quiet, orderly, full of things that belong to everyone equally. I asked the young woman at the desk where I'd find anything on property law in Ontario, and on powers of attorney, and on what rights a person has to her own home. She didn't ask why. She just brought me a stack and pointed me to a table by the window, and I sat there for the better part of 4 hours with a pencil and the little spiral notebook I keep in my purse, and I read. I learned things that afternoon that I wish every woman my age knew. I learned that no one can sell your home out from under you if your name alone is on the title and your mind is sound. And mine was sound, whatever Greg wanted to imply. I learned that a power of attorney only does what you let it do, and that I had never signed one. I learned there were ways to put a property somewhere that a child couldn't touch it no matter how badly they wanted to. And I learned that what Greg was counting on, more than anything, was my ignorance and my politeness. 2 things I had decided, somewhere around hour 3 at that library table, to stop providing. I knew I needed more than books. I needed a person, so when I got home I sat down with the phone book. Yes, I still have one, and yes, I still use it, and I found a lawyer in Lindsay, a woman named Frances Okafor, whose little listing said she did real estate, wills and estates, and elder law. I called and made an appointment for the following Thursday, and when Trish phoned that evening to see how I was feeling about everything, I told her I was coming round to the idea that Riverside Gardens did look like a nice place in the photos. I could hear her smiling. I could hear her covering the receiver to tell Greg. And I hung up and sat in Frank's old recliner, the one with the spring gone, and I said out loud to the empty room, "Trish, my darling girl, you have made a serious mistake. You've gone and mistaken my silence for surrender." Frances Okafor's office smelled of coffee and paper and the particular dustiness of law books that get actually used. She was perhaps 50, brisk and warm at once, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. The first thing I noticed, and the thing that made me trust her, was that she spoke to me like I was a grown woman with a working mind. So many people talk to those of us past 70 as though age were a kind of deafness, loudly and slowly and with too many smiles. Frances just said, "Tell me what's going on, Mrs. Holloway," and folded her hands and listened. So I told her. All of it. Frank, the title, the spring of questions, Greg and his capital, the brochure, my decision to play the agreeable old woman while I figured out my footing. She listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she was quiet a moment, And then she said something I'll carry to my own grave. She said, "Eleanor, you walked in here better prepared than half the people I see who have law degrees." Then she laid out my options, and they were better than I dared hope, because the cottage was in my name alone. Frank and I had owned it jointly, and after he died I'd had it transferred properly. The way you're supposed to. Greg and Trish had no legal power over it whatsoever. None. His talk of freeing up capital was just talk. I could refuse the whole thing, and they could do precisely nothing. But Francis explained, the way I'd been hoping someone would, that simply refusing wasn't my only move, and might not be my best one. Because a flat refusal left the door open for the campaign I feared, the "she's not competent" campaign. What I wanted, she said, was to make the question of my home so completely, permanently settled that there was nothing left for them to push against. She told me about a few things. About a life interest, where you could place the property somewhere and keep the absolute right to live in it until you died. About the difference between a will, which can be contested and changed, and other instruments that are far harder to touch. And she told me I could place my home into a trust, with myself in control of it for as long as I lived, and a beneficiary of my own choosing, someone who was emphatically not the people trying to take it. We talked for over an hour. When I left, I had the beginning of a plan and a second appointment booked, and I drove home along the lake road in the thin March sunshine, feeling something I hadn't felt since Frank died. I felt awake. 3 days later, Frances confirmed what I'd half suspected. She'd done a routine title search just to make sure there were no surprises, and the search turned one up. Someone had already contacted 2 real estate brokerages in the Cowarthas, requesting a market valuation on my property. The requests had been made by a Gregory Vance, that's Greg, describing himself as acting on behalf of the estate, as though I were already dead, as though my home were already an asset to be settled. There was no estate. I was very much alive and breathing and sitting at my own kitchen table. He had no authority, no power of attorney, no standing at all. He'd simply told 2 brokerages he did, and they'd believed him, and they'd sent him a number. The number was $490,000. I sat with that figure a long while. $490,000. The dock Frank rebuilt 3 times. The maple. The 43 winters. My son-in-law had put a price on it and started shopping it around before I'd so much as agreed to look at a brochure, and my daughter had let him. That was the thing that cut deepest. Not Greg, who I'd never trusted, but Trish, who knew. Who'd grown up in that kitchen. Who must have signed off on the whole thing. I'll tell you honestly, I had 3 bad days after that. I'm not made of stone, whatever I might sound like. I sat in Frank's chair and I grieved, not for the cottage, which I had no intention of losing, but for the daughter I thought I'd raised, who it turned out had never quite existed the way I'd imagined her. On the 4th morning, I phoned my friend Marguerite. She's been my closest friend for 38 years, since our girls were small and ran wild together on the shore road, and she answers her phone on the 2nd ring. Always has. None of this letting it go to voicemail. I told her everything, and unlike with Frances, I didn't have to keep my voice steady. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Eleanor, have you eaten anything today?" And I laughed, the first time I'd laughed in 2 weeks. I said I had. "Good," she said. "Now listen to me. You've done everything right. You got yourself a lawyer, you've protected the place, and you haven't lost your head. The capacity thing, that's a scare tactic, and it only works on women who let it. You're not going to let it. You're right. That's the gift of an old friend, someone who hands you back the thing you already knew but couldn't quite hear in your own voice." Marguerite also gave me something practical. Her late husband had dealt, years back, with a nonprofit out of Toronto, the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, that helped older people facing exactly this kind of family trouble. I called them that afternoon. A counselor named David spoke with me for nearly an hour, confirmed everything Frances had said, and added one thing that mattered enormously. He said if Greg or Trish ever did formally challenge my mental capacity, the bar was high, and a woman who'd independently hired her own lawyer, understood a trust document, and ran her own finances would not be found incompetent by any court in this province. The threat, he said, was almost certainly empty, but to be safe, he gave me the name of a geriatrician in Peterborough who did brief capacity assessments for just these situations. I made the appointment. I had the assessment. I have, to this day, a letter on official stationery stating that Eleanor Ruth Holloway is of entirely sound mind and judgment. I keep it in the same folder as my marriage certificate. They feel like cousins, somehow. Here is what I did, working with Frances over those next 2 weeks, while Trish and Greg believed I was quietly resigning myself to Riverside Gardens. We transferred the cottage into a trust. I was the trustee and controlled it completely for as long as I lived. I could live there, change my mind, sell it myself if I ever wanted, do anything an owner does. But the named beneficiary, the one who'd receive it after I was gone, was not Trish and not Greg. I directed it instead toward the local conservation foundation that looks after the wetlands at the north end of Cameron Lake, a place Frank loved and where his ashes are scattered, along with being under that maple. Frances added one precise touch. Any sale of the property required not just my signature, but a separate confirmation letter from her office, delivered to the title company at least 3 business days before any closing. Without that letter, no honest lawyer in Ontario would let a sale go through. We filed it all on a Wednesday. As of that afternoon, the cottage no longer belonged to Eleanor Holloway, private citizen. It belonged to a trust whose terms not one living soul knew but me and Frances. Greg, it turned out, had scheduled a signing for the following Saturday. He'd retained a lawyer of his own, a fellow named Doyle, whom I never met until the day it all came down, and who, I would learn, had taken Greg entirely at his word and never run a title search of his own. Another man who assumed the old woman would simply comply. They came on Saturday morning, the two of them dressed the way people dress when they want to seem warm, but also want you to know they have money. Trish brought a coffee cake. Greg brought a folder. We sat in my living room, me in Frank's chair, which I will not apologize for, and Greg slid a paper across the coffee table and explained in his patient voice that it was a simple transfer just to streamline things for tax purposes, and that of course I'd go on living there. They'd see to everything. It was all just a formality. A formality. I looked at the paper. I looked at my son-in-law. I looked at my daughter, who was studying the coffee cake as though it required her full attention. And I said, Greg, I appreciate you both coming all this way. And the answer is no. The room changed temperature. Trish's head came up. Greg's patience slid right off his face, and underneath it was the thing I'd known was there all along. He said with the careful menace of a man who'd rehearsed it, that if I kept making decisions like this on my own, without the family's input, they might have to look into whether I needed help managing my affairs. There it was, the threat plain as the lake out the window. I let him finish. Then I said, very evenly, I've already retained a lawyer. I've already made my arrangements, and I've already been examined by a geriatrician who has put in writing that my mind is perfectly sound. So if either of you would like to challenge my competence, you're welcome to try, but I'd start by reading that letter first. I told them I thought they should go, and they went. Not with the dignity of people who'd made their point, but with the tight, white-knuckled fury of people who'd just realized they were losing something they'd already spent in their heads. I did go to that signing, by the way. I wouldn't have missed it. I arrived 10 minutes early in the navy suit I'd worn to Frank's retirement due 20 years back, that still fit because I've always been careful about that sort of thing. Frances was waiting in the lobby with a folder under her arm, tabbed in colored markers, the kind of preparation that tells the other side everything before a word is spoken. The buyers were a young couple, the Tremblays, school teachers from Peterborough, nervous and hopeful, with a deposit check and the particular look of people about to spend their life savings. My heart actually went out to them. They'd wandered into my story carrying nothing but a reasonable dream. We all sat down in the boardroom. Doyle, Greg's lawyer, ran it like a man who expected to be home by lunch. He confirmed my identity, confirmed the address, began laying out the agreement of purchase and sale, and I let him get all the way to the point of asking me to sign before I said, "Before we go further, I'd like to introduce my own lawyer, Francis Okafor, who has something relevant to the title." Doyle's head came up. Greg's face did something I'd never seen it do. Francis laid one document on the table, then another, then a third, speaking in that even unhurried voice of someone who has done this many times and is afraid of nothing. The property, she explained, had been transferred into the Holloway Trust some weeks earlier, with me as sole trustee. Any sale required her office's confirmation letter, delivered 3 business days before closing, and no such letter had been issued, because no such sale had been authorized. She set down the trust deed. She set down the title search. She set down the registration confirmation from the land registry office, date stamped, right in the center of the table where every soul could see it. I watched Doyle read it. His face wasn't the face of a man surprised so much as a man realizing in real time that he had built an entire morning on sand. He hadn't run a title search. He'd taken Greg's word for everything, and now it had cost him a great deal more than a Saturday. Greg stood up. He started and stopped and started again. "Mom, what did you do?" He'd never once called me Mom in his life. The desperation of it. "I protected my home," I said. The Tremblay's lawyer leaned over and murmured to them, and the young couple gathered their check and their coats. Mrs. Tremblay paused at the door and looked back at me, and there was something in her face. Not anger, but a kind of recognition, woman to woman, and they left without a word. The door clicked shut behind them, soft and final. Trish hadn't said anything at all. She was just looking at me, and for the first time in months she was actually seeing me, and I think what she saw frightened her. "Eleanor," I said to my own daughter, and I called her by her full name on purpose, the way you do when a thing has changed. "The cottage is mine. It has always been mine, and it will stay mine for as long as I choose to live in it. If you have questions about what happens to it after I'm gone, I'd suggest you speak to a lawyer. Not this one." Doyle did not look up. I gathered my folder, I thanked Francis, and I walked out through the lobby into the April light, where the snow was off the ground at last, and the air smelled like meltwater and possibility, and I stood on the sidewalk a moment just breathing, because I hadn't realized until then how long I'd been holding my breath. The silence from Trish lasted 12 days. In those 12 days I did not sit and brood. I washed the windows. I repainted the back bedroom that had needed it for 2 years. I ordered 2 new chairs for the dock. Behind the dresser, I moved Turi to baseboard. I found a drawing Trish had done at 6 or 7, our cottage, a yellow sun, 3 stick figures holding hands by a blue scribble of lake, her name printed carefully in the corner in that backwards this way, little one's right. I held it for a long time. Then I put it back where I'd found it, behind the dresser, where it had waited 30-some years without asking anything of anyone. On the 13th day, Trish called. Not the managing voice, her real voice, which I hadn't heard since the autumn. She said she was sorry. She said she'd let Greg lead her somewhere she shouldn't have gone, that she told herself a story about it being for my own good and known underneath that it wasn't. I listened to the whole apology. I didn't rush to make it easier for her, the way mothers do, because she needed to say all of it, and I needed to hear all of it. Then I told her I believed she was sorry, and I told her that some things had become true that spring, about who she was willing to be and what she was willing to let happen to me, that I could not unknow. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I was clear. There's a difference, and at 71 I'd finally learned it. I'll tell you what became of them, because I don't think the truth serves anyone by being tidied up. Greg and Trish had spent money they didn't have yet. They'd put a deposit on a bigger house in Barrie, counting on the cottage. They'd borrowed against the sale from Greg's brother. When the money never came, the brother wanted his loan back, and the bigger house fell through, and the deposit went with it. From what drifted back to me, and I'll be honest that it's secondhand, the way news travels in families, there were terrible arguments. Greg's pride took a beating in the small, slow way pride does when a man's plan collapses in front of people whose opinion he cares about. They're still together, last I heard, but something between them cracked that spring and I don't think it's mended. And Trish, I'm still working out. We talk now every couple of weeks. Not the way we did before Frank died. That easiness is gone, and maybe it should be. But we talk. She drove up at Thanksgiving alone. And we sat at the kitchen table and didn't resolve anything and acknowledged everything, which I've come to think is sometimes the best a person can do. She didn't ask about the trust. I think she understands now that some doors, once you've tried to force them, don't open the same way again. But they're not bricked over either. I left her a narrow way back, earned through the only currency that counts now, which is time and changed behavior. That's the most a mother can do without becoming a fool, and I'm done being a fool. My life, which had narrowed to a single frightened point that spring, opened up again. I took a watercolor class on Thursday nights at the Legion Hall and discovered I'm not much good at it and don't care. I had Marguerite up for a week in July and we sat on the new dock chairs every evening and watched the loons and talked about nothing, which is the best kind of talking. I drove out to the East Coast in September, finally, to Cape Breton, which Frank and I had always meant to see and never did. And I stood on a headland with the wind coming off the Atlantic and felt, for the first time in 2 years, simply and entirely present. The maple turned gold this past October, the way it does, and I raked the leaves into the bed where Frank's ashes are, the way I always have, and I had my coffee on the porch in the cold, bright mornings, and the cottage stayed quiet and warm and mine. So that's the story of the spring I nearly lost my home and didn't. Here's what I know now that I think I always knew but had never said out loud. Love is not a debt you owe, and silence is not the same as saying yes. A woman who goes quiet has not necessarily given up. She may just be thinking. If anyone in your life has ever mistaken your patience for surrender, I hope you'll remember an old woman on a lake in Ontario who let them think they'd won, right up until the moment they hadn't. What would you have done? Would you have fought them out in the open, or found a quieter way like I did? I'd truly like to know. Leave it for me down below. Some of you, I suspect, know this particular kind of heartbreak better than you'd ever wish to. Stay with me if you'd like. There's more where this came from. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. I've had a lot of cold mornings on that porch since to turn this over in my mind, and the thing I keep coming back to is that nothing that happened was an accident. Greg didn't wake up one day and decide to put a price on my home out of nowhere. It grew the way a crack in the foundation grows, one small assumption at a time, each one let slide because no one named it. And Trish didn't betray me in a single moment either. She let herself be led somewhere, slowly, by telling herself a kinder story than the truth. Every choice they made had a cost waiting at the end of it, and when the costs came due, the lost deposit, the called-in loan, the quiet that settled over their marriage, those weren't punishments visited on them from above. They were simply the bill for what they'd ordered. We don't always get to choose our consequences, but we do choose the actions that summon them. What saved me wasn't luck and it wasn't anger. Anger would have had me shouting no across that kitchen table and losing the war within a month. What saved me was 3 things I had to dig up in myself at 71 when I'd half forgotten I had them. The first was refusing to let what was right get quietly traded away for what was easy. It would have been easier to sign, to keep the peace, to be the agreeable old mother. But I knew the cottage wasn't only mine. It was Frank's life and our 43 years, and handing it over to people who'd lie to get it would have been a kind of betrayal of all that. Holding the line on what's fair, even alone, even when it makes you the difficult one, is its own quiet kind of strength. The second was thinking before I reacted. That afternoon at the Lindsay Library with a pencil and my little notebook was worth more than any amount of weeping. Learning the law, finding Francis, getting that capacity letter, none of it was clever in a showy way. It was just the patient work of understanding a problem fully before answering it. Greg counted on my ignorance. The best thing I ever did was go and get unignorant. and the third was the plain backbone to see it through. Knowing what's right and knowing what to do are useless if you crumple when your own child looks you in the eye and threatens you. I sat in that boardroom in my Navy suit and let them believe they'd won, right up to the last second, and that took a steadiness I didn't know I still owned. If you take one thing from an old woman on a lake, let it be this: be good, but don't mistake goodness for giving yourself away. Be smart enough to learn what you don't yet know, and be tough enough to stand on both, even when your hands are shaking. Those three things together are what kept my coffee warm on my own porch this morning instead of in a day room in Barrie.